Tonight, we'll take you on another quiet journey through time, into one of history's more brutal chapters, told gently so your mind can rest while the past unfolds. The year was 1725, and Europe was having one of its periodic fits of enlightenment, which is to say, people were getting very excited about categorizing things they didn't understand instead of just burning them. Progress, I suppose. You emerged from the forests near Hameln, yes, that Hameln, where the piper supposedly led all the children away. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the villagers who found you stumbling between the trees like a lost prayer. No shoes, no clothes that fit, no language that anyone recognized. Just you, and whatever was happening behind those dark eyes of yours. They said you moved like an animal, but I always thought that was unfair to animals. Animals know what they're doing. You moved like someone who'd forgotten how bodies worked, all elbows and confusion, as if you'd been wearing someone else's skin and couldn't quite figure out how it fit. The local pastor, a man named Father Dietrich, who had opinions about everything and solutions for nothing, declared you either a miracle or a demon. Naturally, the village split down the middle. Half wanted to worship you, half wanted to exorcise you. The pragmatists, and there are always pragmatists, suggested you might just be a very lost farm boy with a head injury. But you weren't ordinary lost, Peter. You were cosmically lost. Lost in a way that made people uncomfortable, because it suggested that maybe all of us were just one wrong turn away from wandering naked through the forest, grunting at strangers. They kept you in the village for months, passing you from house to house like a particularly challenging houseguest. You wouldn't eat cooked food, only raw vegetables and fruit. You wouldn't wear clothes, kept tearing them off and throwing them in corners. You wouldn't speak, obviously, but you would stare. Oh, how you would stare. "He looks right through you," said Goodwife Mueller, who'd taken you in for a week before giving up. "Like he's seeing something terrible behind your shoulder. I wonder now if you were seeing something terrible. Or maybe something beautiful. Maybe you were seeing us as we really were. Scared, small creatures making noise in the dark, pretending we had answers when we barely had questions." The village physician, Dr. Brennan, examined you with the thoroughness of a man who'd read exactly 3 medical texts and considered himself an expert. He declared you had excessive melancholy of the spleen and recommended bloodletting. Because obviously bleeding someone always worked. Obviously. You bit him when he tried to apply the leeches. Good for you. Word spread, as word does. A boy who wouldn't talk, couldn't be civilized, might be feral. In 1725, that was better than a travelling circus. People came from neighbouring towns to stare at you, to poke you, to theorize about your origins. You were Noah's missing son. You were raised by wolves. You were a changeling left by fairies. You were a Protestant plot to undermine Catholic authority. Everyone had a theory. No one had a clue. The local baron, Count von Zimmern, decided you were his problem to solve, or rather, his opportunity to exploit. He had connections in London, friends at court who collected curiosities like other men collected hunting trophies. A speechless wild boy from the German forests. That was exactly the sort of exotic oddity that might catch royal attention. So they caged you. Not in a dungeon. They weren't monsters, they assured themselves. Just a clean, well-lit room with bars on the windows and a lock on the door. For your own safety, they said. To protect you from the crowds, they said. To help you adjust to civilized life, they said. All lies, of course. They caged you because they were afraid of you. Not because you were dangerous. You barely weighed 7 stone and couldn't have hurt a butterfly if you'd wanted to. They were afraid because you represented something they couldn't control or understand. You were the question they couldn't answer, the problem they couldn't solve. And problems, in 1725, got locked away until someone smarter came along to deal with them. I wasn't smarter, but I was available. Count von Zimmern's letter reached me in the autumn of 1726. I was in Nuremberg at the time, working as a tutor for a merchant's children, teaching them Latin conjugations and the proper way to address a bishop. Not exactly thrilling work, but it paid adequately, and no one expected me to perform miracles. The Count's proposition was simple. Accompany a unique ward to London, serve as his keeper and educator, report on his progress to interested parties. The pay was generous. The alternative, continuing to drill irregular verbs into the heads of ungrateful merchants' sons, was not. I said yes before I met you. I wonder sometimes if I would have said no if I'd seen you first. Probably not. I've always been drawn to impossible tasks. It's a character flaw disguised as a virtue. When I arrived in Hameln, they brought me to see you like they were unveiling a particularly prized painting. You were sitting in the corner of your room, methodically tearing pages from a prayer book someone had given you, not reading them, just tearing them into long, precise strips and arranging them in patterns only you could see. "He does that for hours," said the guard. "Never seems to get bored." You looked up when I entered. Not at me exactly, more like through me, as if I was made of glass and you were examining something on the other side. Your hair hung in dark tangles around your face, and your skin had the pale, translucent quality of someone who'd spent too much time indoors. You were maybe 15, maybe 20. It was impossible to tell. "Hello," I said, because I couldn't think of anything else. You tilted your head, the way a dog does when it hears a sound it can't identify. Then you went back to tearing pages. "Me doesn't respond to German," the guard explained, "or Latin, or French. We tried Italian once, and Czech. Nothing." "Maybe he's not trying to respond," I said. "Maybe he's listening." The guard gave me the look people give when they think you're being deliberately obtuse. But you stopped tearing pages, just for a moment, just long enough to look at me again. That's when I knew. Not that I could help you, I had no idea if that was possible, but that I was going to try. Because someone had to. Because you were 15 or 20 years old, and you'd been locked in a room for a year, and no one seemed to think that was a problem worth solving. Because you looked at me like you were drowning, and I've never been able to ignore drowning. "We leave for London next week," I told you. "I hope you'll find it interesting." You reached for another page and tore it into careful strips, but this time you arranged them in the shape of a bird. I took that as a yes. The journey to London took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of you sitting in the corner of a swaying carriage, staring out the window like you were memorizing the landscape. 3 weeks of me trying to start conversations with someone who might not understand the concept of conversation. 3 weeks of innkeepers whispering about the mad boy and charging us extra for the privilege of frightening their other guests. You hated the inns. Too many voices, too many strangers, too many smells that weren't forest and earth and rain. You'd press yourself against the walls and make a sound. Not quite humming, not quite crying, a sound like wind through empty houses. I started requesting rooms on the ground floor, as far from the common areas as possible. I started bringing your meals to the room instead of trying to coax you downstairs. I started talking to you like you were listening, because the alternative was sitting in silence, and silence, I was learning, could be louder than screaming. The roads are terrible, I'd say, settling into my chair after another bone-jarring day of travel. I think the horses are plotting against us. They keep aiming for the deepest ruts they can find. You never responded, but you'd turn your head toward my voice. Sometimes you'd even stop that wind through houses sound. Progress, I told myself, or maybe just wishful thinking. By the time we reached London, I'd filled half a journal with observations about you. The way you sorted objects by texture rather than colour. The way you could sit motionless for hours, then suddenly spring into frantic activity. The way you seemed to understand everything and nothing simultaneously. London, in 1726, was a city convinced of its own importance. The air tasted of coal smoke and ambition, and the streets bustled with the particular energy of people who believed they were living at the centre of the world. You took one look at it, and retreated so far into yourself I thought you might disappear entirely. They'd prepared rooms for us, in a house near Whitehall, close enough to the court that important people could visit without inconveniencing themselves. The rooms were clean, well-appointed, and utterly prison-like. Bars on the windows, locks on the doors, and a garden view that might as well have been a painting for all the access we had to it. "For security," explained Mr. Harrington, the Crown's appointed overseer of unusual persons, which was apparently a real job in 1726. The Crown collected curiosities the way other people collected stamps, obsessively and with little regard for the feelings of the collected. "Security from what?" I asked. "Escape, interference, unwanted attention." He paused, consulting his notes. Though I suppose unwanted attention is rather the point, isn't it? Within a week, the visitors started arriving. Natural philosophers, physicians, clergymen, courtiers with too much time and too little sense. They came to observe, to theorize, to poke and prod and measure. You were the latest addition to the royal menagerie, a living specimen of whatever it was they thought you represented. Dr. Arbuthnot, the king's physician, was the first to examine you properly. He was a kind man, as doctors went, but kindness doesn't compensate for ignorance. He spent 2 hours testing your reflexes, checking your teeth, studying your hands as if they might hold the secret to your speechlessness. Remarkable muscle tone for someone raised outside civilization, he announced, and no signs of malnutrition or disease. Whatever his origins, he's been well cared for. By whom? I asked. Math, my dear fellow, is the question, isn't it? You sat through the examination like a statue, neither resisting nor cooperating, just enduring. I wanted to tell Dr. Arbuthnot that endurance wasn't consent, but I was learning to pick my battles. And besides, you were handling it better than I was. The philosophers were worse than the doctors. Dr. Pemberton from the Royal Society brought measuring instruments and an absolute certainty that your condition could be explained through rational observation. He measured your skull, your limbs, the distance between your eyes. He tested your hearing by shouting at you from different angles. He tried to teach you to write by forcing a quill into your hand and guiding it across paper. He threw the quill across the room and began that wind through houses sound again. Fascinating, Dr. Pemberton murmured, making notes. The subject exhibits clear signs of intelligence, but refuses to engage with symbolic representation. This suggests a fundamental disconnect between comprehension and expression. Or maybe he just doesn't like being treated like a laboratory rat, I suggested. Dr. Pemberton looked at me as if I'd suggested that rats might have feelings. Anthropomorphization is a common error when dealing with primitive subjects. We must resist the urge to project human emotions onto what may be purely instinctual behaviors. You weren't instinctual, Peter. You were just tired. Tired of being stared at, tired of being discussed as if you weren't in the room, tired of people who thought understanding you was a puzzle to be solved rather than a relationship to be built. The worst was Dr. Woodhouse, who specialized in disorders of the mind and had theories about everything. He believed your speechlessness was the result of moral corruption, that you'd been exposed to such depravity in your early life that your soul had retreated, leaving only an empty shell behind. His treatment involved reading scripture aloud for hours, convinced that divine words would penetrate where human words had failed. You would sit through these sessions in apparent calm, but I could see the tension in your shoulders, the way your hands would clench and unclench in your lap. After one particularly lengthy reading from Leviticus, Dr. Woodhouse announced that he was going to try shock therapy, a sudden loud noise designed to startle you into speech. He brought a pistol to our next session. Small, sharp report, he explained, and the blockage in his mind should clear, like uncorking a bottle. Absolutely not, I said. I hardly think you're qualified to make medical decisions. I'm qualified to recognize cruelty when I see it. Dr. Woodhouse drew himself up to his full height, which wasn't particularly impressive. This is cutting-edge treatment based on the latest understanding of mental disorders. Your latest understanding is medieval superstition dressed up in fancy words. You were watching this exchange with something that might have been amusement. Or maybe I was just hoping it was amusement. Either way, Dr. Woodhouse didn't get to fire his pistol at you. Small victories. The courtiers were a different sort of problem. They didn't want to cure you. They wanted to be entertained by you. Lady Pembroke hosted salons where you were the main attraction, seated in a chair like a living ornament, while fashionable people discussed your case over tea and cakes. Do you think he dreams? Lady Pembroke would ask, as if he were a particularly interesting piece of furniture. Can he feel emotions? Lord Chesterfield would wonder, while you sat 3 feet away from him. Is he even truly human? Lady Montague would whisper, as if the question were deliciously scandalous rather than horrifically dehumanizing. You sat through these gatherings with the patience of a saint and the dignity of a king. You never gave them the reactions they wanted, no wild gestures, no animal noises, no convenient displays of your supposed primitiveness. You just sat and stared and occasionally reached for the fruit they always provided for you. I think they disappointed you more than you disappointed them. "He's remarkably well behaved for a wild child," Lady Pembroke commented after one particularly tedious afternoon. "Maybe because he's not actually wild," I said. "Maybe he's just different." "Different how?" "Different in ways we don't understand. Different in ways that don't fit our categories." Lady Pembroke smiled, the sort of smile people use when they think you're being charmingly naive. "My dear man, everything fits into categories. That's what makes us civilized." You were picking grapes from a bowl, eating them one by one with careful deliberation. As Lady Pembroke spoke, you stopped eating and looked directly at her for the first time all afternoon. Not through her, not past her, but at her. Your expression was perfectly neutral, but somehow it contained all the contempt her words deserved. She stopped smiling. "Perhaps," she said, "he understands more than we think." You went back to eating grapes. One by one, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. You'd shown them exactly what you thought of their categories, their certainties, their comfortable assumptions about what made them civilized and what made you wild. You'd shown them that understanding doesn't require words, and that dignity doesn't require speech. You'd shown them that maybe, just maybe, they were the ones who were lost. The winter of 1727 was brutal, even by London standards. The Thames froze solid for 3 months, and the city became a maze of ice and misery. You spent most of those months pressed against the window, staring out at the frozen world with something that looked like longing. I asked Mr. Harrington if we could take walks in the garden. He refused. "Too risky," he said. "Too many opportunities for escape or incident. As if you were a dangerous criminal rather than a young man who'd never hurt anyone in his life." So you paced, back and forth across our rooms, wearing tracks in the carpet, making that wind-through-houses sound when the walls pressed too close. Sometimes you'd stop at the window and press your palms against the glass, leaving handprints that the servants would clean away each morning, only to find them there again by evening. I started sleeping badly. The sound of your pacing would wake me, and I'd lie in the dark listening to your footsteps, regular as a heartbeat. You were mourning something. Freedom, maybe, or the forest you'd left behind, or simply the ability to move through the world without bars and locks and suspicious glances. "He is becoming agitated," Dr. Arbuthnot observed during one of his weekly visits. "Perhaps we should consider restraints." Restraints? The word came out sharper than I intended. Mild ones, padded, simply to prevent him from injuring himself. He's not trying to injure himself. He's trying to exercise, he's trying to think, he's trying to cope with being locked in 3 rooms for months on end. Dr. Arbuthnot made a note in his journal. "You're quite attached to him, aren't you?" "I'm responsible for him." "There's a difference between responsibility and sentiment, Mr. Handler. We must be careful not to let emotional attachment cloud our scientific judgment." Scientific judgment. As if there was anything scientific about keeping a human being in a cage and wondering why he seemed unhappy about it. But you weren't just unhappy, Peter. You were changing. The months of confinement, the endless parade of visitors, the constant examination and discussion, it was wearing you down in ways I didn't fully understand until later. You were retreating deeper into yourself, building walls that even I couldn't breach. You stopped responding to my voice the way you used to. Stopped turning your head when I spoke. Stopped arranging objects in those careful patterns that had seemed so meaningful. You just paced and stared and made sounds that grew fainter each day, as if you were disappearing from the inside out. The visitors noticed too. Lord Chesterfield complained that you were becoming dreadfully dull, no longer reacting to their attempts to provoke responses. Lady Pembroke suggested you might be succumbing to melancholy and recommended stronger measures. Dr. Woodhouse returned with new theories and nastier treatments. He wanted to try mercury, tiny doses designed to stimulate the dormant faculties of speech. When I refused to allow it, he went over my head to Mr. Harrington. "The subject shows clear signs of mental deterioration," he argued. "Without intervention, we risk losing him entirely." "But do you mean losing him?" I asked. "He could retreat so far into his condition that he becomes completely unresponsive. A living body with no mind at all. I've seen it happen with similar cases." "What similar cases?" Dr. Woodhouse waved his hand dismissively. The literature is extensive. The important thing is to act quickly, before the deterioration becomes irreversible. He was lying, of course. There was no literature, no similar cases, no evidence that mercury would do anything except poison you slowly. But Mr. Harrington was convinced by the authority in Dr. Woodhouse's voice, the confidence of his pronouncements, the weight of his reputation. They gave you mercury for 3 weeks. Tiny doses mixed into your food, administered without your knowledge or consent. You became violently ill, vomiting, trembling, unable to keep anything down. Your skin took on a greyish pallor and your eyes developed a glassy, unfocused quality that terrified me. "It's working," Dr. Woodhouse announced with satisfaction. "The toxins are being purged from his system. Soon the blockages will clear. You nearly died. Not from the condition Dr. Woodhouse was pretending to treat, but from the mercury he was using to treat it. For 3 days you lay motionless on your bed. Breathing so shallowly I had to put my ear to your chest to make sure you were still alive. On the 4th day, you opened your eyes and looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in weeks. You were still yourself, still present, still fighting, but something had changed. You'd learned that the people who claimed to be helping you were perfectly willing to kill you in the process. I fired Dr. Woodhouse that afternoon, told him that if he came near you again, I'd throw him out the window personally. He threatened to complain to Mr. Harrington, to the Royal Society, to anyone who would listen. "Go ahead," I said. "Tell them all about your miraculous mercury treatment that nearly murdered a defenseless patient. I'm sure they'll be impressed by your medical expertise." He left in a huff of injured dignity and muttered threats. You watched him go with eyes that had learned to recognize enemies. Recovery took weeks. I fed you broth and bread, held cool cloths to your forehead when the fever spiked, sat beside your bed reading aloud from books I thought you might find interesting. Not medical texts or religious treatises, but stories, adventures, romances, fairy tales. You seemed to like the fairy tales best, maybe because they were about transformation, about characters who were misunderstood, about worlds where being different wasn't necessarily a curse. One afternoon, as I was reading about a prince who'd been turned into a swan, you reached out and touched my hand. Not grabbing, not clinging, just a gentle touch. A thank you, maybe, or a recognition, or simply a reminder that you were still there, still listening, still trusting me, despite everything. "I'm sorry," I said. "I should have protected you better." You kept your hand on mine for a long moment. Then you pulled it back and closed your eyes, but not like someone going to sleep, like someone choosing to rest. The visitors stopped coming after that. Word had spread about your illness, and suddenly the exotic wild boy had become a liability. Sick curiosities weren't nearly as entertaining as healthy ones, and the possibility of contagion made even the most dedicated natural philosophers think twice. Mr. Harrington was displeased. The entire purpose of this arrangement was to provide access for serious scholars, he complained. If the subject is too ill to be examined, then maybe the examining is part of the problem, I said. That's hardly a scientific attitude. Neither is poisoning someone with mercury. We reached a compromise. Fewer visitors, shorter sessions, and I had veto power over any proposed treatments. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the alternative, and you gradually began to recover. Not completely. Something had been damaged during those mercury-poisoned weeks. Some spark that had dimmed and never quite rekindled. You were quieter than before, more withdrawn. But you were alive, and you were still you. You started pacing again, but differently. Less frantic, more purposeful. You'd walk to the window, stand there for exactly the same amount of time each day, then walk to the door and back. A routine that belonged to you, not imposed by others. You started eating again, but only foods you chose. You'd examine each piece of fruit carefully before deciding whether to accept it. You learned to recognize the sounds of approaching footsteps and would position yourself in whatever corner felt safest. You were adapting, learning to survive in a world that saw you as a specimen rather than a person, building defenses that would protect you from the next Dr. Woodhouse, the next miracle cure, the next well-meaning intervention that cared more about solving you than knowing you. I was proud of you for learning these skills. I was heartbroken that you needed them. "He's become quite manageable," Mr. Harrington observed during one of his monthly inspections. "Much less disruptive than before. Manageable. As if you'd been a problem that had finally been solved." But you hadn't been solved, Peter. You'd been broken down, worn down, taught that resistance led to suffering and compliance led to survival. You'd learned to make yourself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. You'd learned to disappear while still being present. And I'd helped them teach you. The years began to blur together after that. 1728, 1729, 1730. A succession of seasons that brought small changes and large disappointments. You grew taller, filled out, developed the kind of physical presence that made people step back involuntarily. Not because you were threatening, but because you occupied space with such complete authority that it reminded them they were taking up space too. The visits from scholars became less frequent, then rare, then non-existent. You'd been in London for 3 years without learning to speak, without providing any dramatic revelations about human nature or the origins of civilization. You'd become, in academic terms, a dead end. In human terms, you'd become my responsibility and my companion. I stopped trying to teach you things you didn't want to learn. No more attempts at writing, no more vocabulary lessons, no more efforts to make you sit properly at table, or wear shoes, or behave like a proper English gentleman. Instead, I started learning from you. You taught me that silence isn't the absence of communication. It's a different kind of language entirely. You spoke with your hands, your posture, your expressions. You told me when you were hungry by leading me to the kitchen. You showed me when you were tired by curling up in specific corners. You expressed happiness by arranging objects in complicated patterns and sadness by leaving them scattered. You taught me that routine wasn't boring, it was sacred. Every morning you'd wake at exactly the same time, perform exactly the same sequence of actions, eat exactly the same breakfast. Not because you lacked imagination, but because consistency was the foundation on which you built your sense of safety. In a world that kept trying to change you, routine was rebellion. You taught me that joy didn't require reason. You'd spend hours watching dust motes dance in afternoon sunlight, utterly absorbed in something the rest of us had learned to ignore. You'd laugh, actually laugh, at things that weren't funny to anyone else. The way shadows moved across walls, the sound of rain against windows, the particular texture of certain fabrics. Your laughter was rare and precious. It sounded like surprise, like someone discovering something wonderful that had been hidden in plain sight. It made me realize how little I'd been paying attention to the world around me, how much beauty I'd been missing while focused on more important things. You taught me that love didn't require understanding. I never did figure out what was happening in your mind, never cracked the code of your inner life, but I loved you anyway. Not in spite of your mystery, but because of it. You were proof that human connection could exist without explanation, that caring for someone didn't mean comprehending them. The first time I realized I loved you was during the winter of 1730. You'd been ill. Nothing serious, just a cold that left you listless and congested. I'd been sitting up with you for 3 nights, checking your breathing, bringing you water, reading aloud even though you seemed too tired to listen. On the 3rd night, you reached out in your sleep and took my hand. Not dramatically, not desperately, just reached out and held on. Like a child might hold a parent's hand, or a friend might offer comfort, or a person might anchor themselves to something solid in the dark. You held my hand all night, and I sat there, uncomfortable and cramped and completely unwilling to move, because you needed something from me that I could actually give. Not expertise, not cures, not answers, just presence. Just the warmth of another human being who cared whether you lived or died. When you woke up the next morning, you looked at our joined hands with surprise, as if you'd forgotten reaching for me. But you didn't pull away immediately. You squeezed my fingers once gently before letting go. A thank you that needed no words. That's when I knew. This wasn't duty anymore, or professional obligation, or even sympathy. This was love. Complicated, inexplicable, absolutely real love. for a young man who'd been thrown into my life by accident and had somehow become the center of it. I started talking to you differently after that, not like a patient or a ward or a research subject, but like a friend. I told you about my childhood, my fears, my dreams for the future. I complained about the weather, gossiped about our neighbours, shared my opinions about books and politics and the general stupidity of mankind. You listened to everything with the same patient attention you brought to watching dust motes. Sometimes you'd nod, or tilt your head, or make soft sounds that might have been agreement or encouragement. Sometimes you'd just stare at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. "Do you think I'm talking too much?" I asked one evening, after a particularly long monologue about my frustrations with Mr. Harrington. You picked up a book from the table and handed it to me. Not any book. The volume of fairy tales we'd been reading together. You opened it to a story about a princess who could only speak in whispers, and pointed to the first line. Once upon a time there was a princess who knew that the most important things could only be said quietly. I don't know if you understood the words, or if you just recognized the shape of the story, or if you were making a connection I couldn't see, but you'd answered my question perfectly. You wanted me to keep talking. You wanted the stories, the complaints, the rambling thoughts. You wanted the sound of another voice in the room, the comfort of shared silence broken by shared words. You wanted conversation, even if you couldn't contribute to it in the way others expected. The years passed. 1731, 1732, 1733. You grew into yourself, became more solid somehow, more definitively you. You developed preferences, habits, small rituals that belonged to no one else. You'd arrange your breakfast a specific way every morning, fruit on the left, bread on the right, water glass precisely centered. You'd fold your clothes in geometric patterns that probably made sense to you. You'd sit in the same chair, at the same angle, for the same amount of time each afternoon. People who didn't know you might have called these behaviors obsessive or meaningless. I called them poetry. You were creating order in a world that had never made sense to you, building beauty out of small, controllable things. You were an artist whose medium was daily life. You hated loud noises, loved soft textures, and had an uncanny ability to predict changes in weather. You'd become restless hours before storms hit, pacing and humming until the first drops of rain finally fell. You'd grow calm before sunny days, settling into that perfect stillness that made you look like a statue of yourself. You cried sometimes, but always silently. Tears would just appear on your cheeks without warning, without apparent cause. When I asked what was wrong, stupid question, but I always asked, you'd touch your chest and then gesture toward the window, toward the world outside that you could see but not reach. You were homesick for a place you'd never been able to describe, lonely for a life you'd never been allowed to live, grieving for possibilities that had been taken away before you'd even known they existed. I was grieving too, for the conversations we'd never have, for the future you'd never be allowed to choose, for the person you might have been if the world had been kinder, but also somehow grieving for the person I might have been if I'd never met you. You'd changed me, Peter, made me quieter, more attentive, less certain about things I'd thought I understood. You'd taught me that intelligence came in forms I'd never considered, that communication was more than words, that love didn't require permission or explanation or even reciprocity. You'd taught me that taking care of someone wasn't the same as taking care of something, that responsibility could become affection, that duty could become devotion, that a job could become a calling without you even noticing it happening. You'd taught me that some of the most important relationships in life don't fit any categories, don't follow any rules, don't make any sense to anyone except the people living them. You'd taught me that love without language was still love. Maybe the purest kind of love. Love that couldn't be argued with, explained away, or reduced to words that never quite captured what they were trying to say anyway. You taught me to love you without understanding you, and in doing so, you taught me to love the mystery of human connection itself. By 1735, the novelty had worn off completely. You'd been in London for nearly a decade, and the scholarly community had moved on to newer curiosities. The wild boy, who wouldn't speak, couldn't be civilized, and refused to provide dramatic insights, had become an expensive inconvenience. Mr. Harrington summoned me to his office on a grey February morning, the kind of day when London felt like a city built entirely of wet ash and disappointment. "The Crown's interest in maintaining the subject has diminished," he announced, shuffling through papers that probably contained your entire life reduced to bureaucratic summaries. The expense of his care, combined with the lack of scientific progress, makes continuation of the current arrangement untenable. "What are you suggesting?" "Relocation to somewhere more appropriate for his long-term care." He paused, studying a document. "There's an institution in Bethlehem that specializes in cases like his." Bethlehem. Bedlam. The madhouse where they kept people who didn't fit anywhere else, where tourists paid to gawk at the inmates like they were animals in a zoo, where people went to disappear. "Absolutely not. I hardly think you're in a position to refuse. Then put me in a position to accept. Find us somewhere else, somewhere better." Mr. Harrington looked genuinely surprised, as if the idea that I might care about your welfare had never occurred to him. "You wish to continue as his keeper?" "I wish to continue as his friend." "That's unusual." "So is he." It took 3 months of negotiations, bureaucratic manoeuvring, and what I can only describe as shameless begging, but we found a solution, a small estate in Hertfordshire, far enough from London to be forgotten, but close enough for occasional official visits. The previous owner had died without heirs, and the Crown was happy to find a use for property that was otherwise just sitting empty, accumulating dust and taxes. The house was perfect for us, modest but comfortable, with large windows that faced south and east, catching morning light that you loved to sit in. There was a garden, overgrown and wild, which you preferred to the manicured precision of formal landscaping. There were fields beyond the garden, and woods beyond the fields, and horizons that stretched farther than anything you'd seen since your childhood in the German forests. The day we moved, you stood in the main room of our new home and turned in a slow circle, taking in the space. No bars on the windows, no locks on the inside of doors, no guards, no visitors, no schedule imposed by other people's curiosity. Just us, and quiet, and the possibility of living rather than merely existing. You walked to the largest window and pressed your palms against the glass, but this time, when you pulled your hands away, you immediately walked to the door and tried the handle. It opened. You stepped outside, onto the stone steps, into air that didn't smell of coal smoke and other people's ambitions. You stood there for 10 minutes, breathing. Just breathing. As if you'd forgotten what fresh air tasted like. Then you came back inside, sat down in the chair nearest the window, and looked at me with something that might have been gratitude, or relief, or the kind of peace that comes from finally being able to rest. "Home," I said, though I wasn't sure you understood the word. You nodded. Once, decisively, you understood. The first year in Hertfordshire was a revelation. Away from the constant observation, the endless theories, the pressure to be something other than yourself, you began to unfold. Not change exactly, but become more yourself than you'd been allowed to be in years. You spent hours in the garden, not working it, but simply being in it. You'd sit among the weeds and wildflowers, absolutely still, watching insects navigate their complicated lives. You'd follow the paths of butterflies like they were writing messages in the air. You'd lie on your back and stare at clouds until they shifted into shapes that meant something to you. You developed a relationship with the local wildlife that bordered on the supernatural. Birds would land on your shoulders, your hands, your head. Rabbits would graze within arm's reach while you sat motionless in the grass. Once I watched a deer approach you so closely I thought it might try to take food from your hands. When it finally bounded away, you turned to me with an expression of pure joy, as if you'd been given an unexpected gift. "Be my know you're safe," I said. "Animals always know." You made a sound I'd never heard before. Not quite humming, not quite singing, but something musical and pleased. Your version of agreement, maybe, or happiness, or recognition that, yes, you were finally safe. The locals were curious about us, of course. Stories had a way of spreading, and the tale of the wild boy and his keeper had reached Hertfordshire long before we did. But country people have a different relationship with oddity than city people do. They're more practical, less theoretical. They didn't want to study you or cure you or theorize about your origins. They just wanted to know if you were going to cause trouble. When it became clear that you weren't, that you kept to yourself, bothered no one, and seemed content to live quietly on the edge of their community, they left us alone. Not unfriendly, just respectfully distant, which was exactly what you needed. Mrs. Fletcher, who brought us eggs and milk twice a week, was the only local who showed any interest in actually knowing you. She was a widow in her 60s, practical and unflappable, who treated you like a particularly shy nephew rather than a scientific curiosity. "Does he like jam?" she asked one morning, unpacking her basket. "He likes sweet things," I said. "Strawberry or apricot?" "I'm not sure he's tried either." She produced 2 small jars and set them on the table in front of you. "Try both," she said, as if speaking to any normal person. "See which you prefer." You tasted each jam carefully, considered them both, then pointed to the apricot. "Good choice," Mrs. Fletcher said approvingly. "I'll bring more next week." And she did. Every week for the next 5 years, she brought apricot jam along with the eggs and milk. Never made a fuss about it, never acted like she was doing us a favour. Just included it in her delivery like it was the most natural thing in the world. You looked forward to her visits. I could tell because you'd position yourself near the window on the morning she was due, watching for her cart to appear down the lane. When she arrived, you'd follow her around the kitchen while she unpacked her goods, not getting in the way but staying close enough to observe her efficient movements. "He's a good lad," she told me once as you carefully examined a particularly large egg. "Quiet, but good. You can see it in his eyes." "What can you see?" "Kindness. And sadness. But mostly kindness." She was right, of course. You were kind, Peter. Gentle in ways that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with choice. You'd learned early that the world could be cruel, but you'd somehow decided not to be cruel back. You'd been hurt, confused, isolated, treated like a specimen and a problem and a burden, but you'd never responded with violence or anger or hatred. You'd chosen kindness when you had every reason to choose otherwise, and that choice, made again and again over the years, had shaped you into someone worthy of the love I'd learned to feel for you. The seasons passed in comfortable routine. You had your patterns, your preferences, your small rituals that marked the days and weeks. You'd wake with the sun, eat the same breakfast, spend the morning in the garden, the afternoon reading, or at least looking at the pictures in books, the evening sitting by the fire while I read aloud. You aged, but differently than other people. Your hair greyed at the temples, your face developed lines around the eyes, your movements became slightly stiffer. But you never lost that quality of elsewareness, that sense that you were living in this world but not entirely of it, as if you were a traveller who'd stopped for a long visit but never quite unpacked all your bags. You were content, I think, as content as anyone could be who'd spent half their life as someone else's curiosity. You had space, quiet, routine, and the kind of care that didn't come with conditions or expectations. You had a home, but you were also waiting. I could see it sometimes, in the way you'd pause in your daily activities and stare toward the horizon, not looking for anything specific, just listening, for something I couldn't hear, some signal that would tell you it was time to move on. You were waiting to go home. The only problem was that home, for you, wasn't a place you could reach by walking. The years accumulated. 1740, 1745, 1750. You settled into middle age with the same grace you'd brought to everything else. Quietly, without complaint, with dignity that no amount of mistreatment had been able to take away from you. You were stronger than anyone had expected, healthier than the doctors had predicted, more resilient than the philosophers had theorized. You outlived most of your original observers, outlasted the interest of several generations of scholars, outlived the crown officials who'd brought you to England in the first place. You lived long enough to prove that all their theories had been wrong. You weren't dying of civilization, weren't pining away for your wild origins, weren't succumbing to the melancholy that supposedly affected your type. You were just living, day by day, in the careful, deliberate way you'd learned to navigate a world that had never quite made room for you. But living isn't the same as being free, and freedom, for you, had always been something other people decided you could or couldn't have. You lived longer than anyone expected, just not freely, never freely. And I think, toward the end, that waiting became a burden too heavy for even your patient heart to carry. The winter of 1784 was harsh, even for England. Snow fell early and stayed late, and the cold seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. You'd always been sensitive to weather changes, but this winter affected you differently. You moved more slowly, slept longer, spent more time sitting by the fire with your hands spread toward the warmth. I told myself it was just age. You were nearly 60 after all. Though we'd never known your exact birth date, we'd marked your years from the time you were found. 60 years of a life that had never been entirely your own. 60 years of adapting to a world that had never quite adapted to you. But it wasn't just age. There was something else, something I couldn't name, but could feel in the quality of your silence. It was deeper now, more complete, as if you were slowly withdrawing from the surface of life, diving down to some quiet place where the noise of the world couldn't reach you. You stopped eating as much. Mrs. Fletcher noticed first, commenting that you'd barely touched the apricot jam she'd brought the week before. "Is he feeling poorly?" she asked, studying your face with the practiced eye of someone who'd raised 6 children and outlived 3 husbands. "I don't think so," I said. "Just tired." But you weren't just tired, you were something else. Something for which I didn't have words. You were like a traveller who'd been waiting at a station for so long that the waiting itself had become the journey. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived you seemed to revive slightly. You spent longer hours in the garden, sitting among the early flowers with the same patient attention you'd always brought to the world around you. You watched the birds building nests, the insects emerging from winter hiding, the slow unfurling of leaves and blossoms. But even your garden time felt different, more ceremonial somehow, as if you were saying goodbye to things you'd loved, taking final inventory of the small beauties that had sustained you through the long years of captivity and care. I started sleeping badly again, waking in the night to check on you. You were always there, always breathing, always present. But presence, I was learning, wasn't the same as permanence. Even the most solid things could vanish without warning. The summer of 1785 was beautiful. Warm but not oppressive, with gentle rains that kept the garden green and lush. You seemed to rally in the good weather, spending whole days outside, moving slowly but purposefully through the space you'd made your own. You developed a new routine that summer. Every evening just before sunset, you'd walk the perimeter of the garden. Not quickly, not urgently, but with the careful attention of someone memorizing a beloved landscape. You'd touch certain trees, certain flowers, certain stones that had meaning only to you. Then you'd come inside and sit in your chair by the window, watching the light fade from the sky. You'd stay there until full darkness fell, as if you were supervising the transition from day to night, making sure the world successfully completed its daily transformation. I'd sit with you during these evening vigils, reading or writing or just sharing the quiet. Sometimes I'd tell you about my day, about letters I'd received from London, about my plans for improving the garden next year. You'd listen with the same patient attention you'd always given to my rambling monologues, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of acknowledgement. But increasingly, I felt like I was talking to someone who was already half gone. Still present, still caring, but somehow preparing for departure, like a guest who'd packed their bags but hadn't yet announced they were leaving. The end, when it came, was gentle. No drama, no struggle, no sudden crisis that demanded immediate decisions, just a gradual slowing down, a quiet settling, like a clock running down in the most natural way possible. You'd been moving more slowly for weeks, eating less, sleeping more. But you were still yourself, still arranging objects in careful patterns, still sitting by the window each morning, still responding to my voice with subtle signs of recognition and affection. On your last day, you seemed almost lighter, more present than you'd been in months, but in a way that felt temporary, like a candle flaring brighter just before it goes out. You ate breakfast with more appetite than you'd shown in weeks. You spent the morning in the garden, sitting in your favourite spot among the late roses, watching the world with the intense attention you'd brought to everything since I'd known you. That afternoon, you came inside and arranged all your possessions. The few clothes, the smooth stones you'd collected, the books with pictures you'd loved, in precise patterns on your bed. Not packing exactly, but organising. Putting things in order for someone else to find. As evening approached, you walked to your chair by the window for the last time. But instead of sitting immediately, you turned to me and held out your hand. Not reaching for support, not grasping, just offering. An invitation. I took your hand and you guided me to the chair beside yours. We sat there together as the sun set, your hand warm and steady in mine, watching the light fade from the sky one last time. You died just after midnight. No struggle, no pain, no final crisis. You simply stopped breathing, as naturally as falling asleep. Your hand was still in mine, still warm, still connected to the life you'd lived with such quiet dignity for 60 years. I sat with you until dawn, holding your hand and talking to you the way I'd always talked to you, assuming you could hear, assuming you cared, assuming the connection we'd built over 30 years was stronger than the transition you were making. I told you I loved you. I told you I was proud of the way you'd lived, the way you'd survived, the way you'd remained yourself despite everything that had been done to you and taken from you. I told you that knowing you had been the greatest privilege of my life. I told you that you'd taught me more about being human than any book, any philosophy, any theory ever could. That you'd shown me what dignity looked like when it was stripped of everything except choice. That you'd demonstrated the possibility of love without language, connection without comprehension, devotion without explanation. I told you that you'd been the best person I'd ever known, and that the world had been lucky to have you in it, even if the world had never been smart enough to recognize its luck. The birds started singing just as the sun rose, and I realized you'd waited for that. Your last evening vigil, your final supervision of the world's daily transformation from darkness to light. You'd made sure everything was in order before you left. Mrs. Fletcher came that morning with eggs and milk and apricot jam, and found me still sitting beside you, still holding your hand. She took one look at your peaceful face and my exhausted one, and simply set down her basket and put her arms around both of us. "He was a good lad," she said, and her voice was steady even though her eyes were full of tears. "The best kind of person, quiet but good. We buried you in the garden, among the roses you'd loved and the birds that had trusted you. The local vicar conducted a simple service, and Mrs. Fletcher brought flowers from her own garden to lay on your grave. A few neighbours came to pay their respects, not because they'd known you well, but because they'd recognised your gentleness and wanted to honour it. I spoke at your service, though I'm not sure I made much sense. I tried to explain who you'd been, what you'd meant, why the world was dimmer without you in it. But words had never been adequate for you in life, and they weren't adequate for you in death either. Instead, I told them about your kindness, about the way animals trusted you, children smiled at you, and even strangers felt calmer in your presence. I told them about your patience, your resilience, your ability to find beauty in the smallest things. I told them about the love you'd given without expecting anything in return, the care you'd shown for a world that had never quite known how to care for you. I told them that you'd been a teacher disguised as a student, a philosopher disguised as a simpleton, a saint disguised as a curiosity, that you'd lived with more grace and wisdom than most people achieve in twice as many years. I told them that I would miss you every day for the rest of my life. The silence in the house after you died was different from any silence I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of presence, of the particular quality of attention you'd brought to everything. The house felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture or decoration, and everything to do with the loss of a consciousness that had made every room feel inhabited. I stayed on at the house for another 3 years, tending your grave, maintaining the garden, writing letters to officials who needed to be informed of your death. But it wasn't the same place without you. It was just a house again, not a home. In 1788, I moved back to London. Not because I wanted to, but because living in our house without you felt like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else. Everything was the right size, the right shape, but nothing fit properly anymore. I've spent the years since then trying to write about you, to capture something of who you were and what you meant, but every attempt falls short because you were larger than language, more complex than any story I could tell. You were proof that humanity doesn't require speech, that intelligence doesn't require education, that love doesn't require comprehension. You were evidence that some of the most important truths can't be spoken, only lived. You were a question mark in human form, a puzzle that couldn't be solved because it was never meant to be. You were a reminder that the world is full of mysteries that don't need explaining, only appreciating. You were my teacher, my friend, my greatest responsibility, and my deepest joy. You were the center of my life for 30 years, and the missing piece of it ever since. You died holding my hand, Peter, and the silence hasn't left. It follows me through my days, sits with me through my nights, reminds me constantly that there are spaces in the world that can only be filled by specific people, and when those people are gone, the spaces remain empty forever. But it's not a bitter silence, it's patient, gentle, full of the same quiet dignity you brought to everything. It's the kind of silence that holds memory, that preserves love, that keeps the essential part of a person alive long after their body has returned to the earth. It's your silence, Peter. The silence you lived in, the silence you taught me to appreciate, the silence you left behind as a gift to someone who'd spent too many years trying to fill every moment with words. It's the silence that says some things are too important for language, too deep for explanation, too sacred for anything except quiet remembrance and lasting love. Thank you for teaching me to listen to it. Thank you for teaching me that the most important conversations happen without words, that the deepest connections transcend understanding, that love is something you do, not something you say. Thank you for being exactly who you were, even when the world wanted you to be someone else. Thank you for 60 years of patient, gentle, impossible humanity. Thank you for holding my hand when you died, and for leaving your silence with me when you left. I carry it with me everywhere I go. It's the heaviest and lightest thing I've ever held. It's the echo of a voice that never spoke, but somehow said everything that mattered. It's you, Peter, still present, still teaching, still loved. And so we come to the end of this story, though of course no story really ends. They just stop being told, leaving the rest to imagination and memory, and the particular kind of silence that follows every true thing that's ever been said. Peter, whoever he really was, wherever he really came from, lived and died and disappeared into history the way most people do, quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind only the hearts he'd touched and the lives he'd changed. He never learned to speak our language, but he spoke something deeper, something that didn't require words or explanation or the approval of scholars and kings. He spoke love, patience, endurance, the radical possibility that you could live a meaningful life without ever explaining yourself to anyone. The world moved on, as worlds do. New curiosities replaced old ones, new theories replaced old theories, new ways of being cruel to vulnerable people replaced the old ways. But Peter had escaped all that by then. He'd found his freedom in the only place it was ever really available to him, in death, in the garden where roses still bloom over his grave, in the memory of one man who loved him without understanding him, and who carried that love until his own death 30 years later. We tell these stories, these brutal histories, because we need to remember. Not just the facts, though facts matter, but the feelings, the human cost of human curiosity, the price paid by people who were different, vulnerable, inconvenient, the love that existed in the spaces between cruelty and indifference. We tell them because Peter's story isn't just Peter's story. It's the story of everyone who's ever been seen as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. Everyone who's been studied instead of befriended, categorized instead of cared for, managed instead of loved. It's the story of all the silent voices, all the unheard languages, all the forms of human communication that don't fit into our narrow definitions of normal. And it's the story of the people who love them anyway, the handlers and caregivers and friends who see past the surface strangeness to the deeper humanity underneath, who choose connection over understanding, relationship over explanation, presence over answers. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about Peter. Think about the boy who never spoke but somehow said everything. Think about the life that was lived so quietly it almost disappeared entirely, but managed to teach one person, and now maybe you, about the true nature of love and patience and gentle resistance. Think about the fact that right now, somewhere, there are people like Peter, people who don't fit, who can't be easily categorized, who live in languages the rest of us haven't learned to speak yet, people who need advocates, friends, protectors, people who need someone to see past their differentness to their humanity. Think about the possibility that understanding isn't always the goal, that sometimes love is enough, that sometimes the deepest connections happen without words, without explanations, without the need to make sense of everything. Think about silence, not as emptiness, but as fullness, not as absence, but as presence, not as failure to communicate, but as a different kind of communication entirely. Think about Peter, who lived for 60 years in a world that never quite knew what to do with him, but who somehow managed to teach at least one person what it meant to be truly, completely, unconditionally human. And then sleep. Rest easy in the knowledge that love doesn't require language, that connection doesn't require comprehension, that the most important things we give each other can't be measured or categorized or explained. Sleep well knowing that somewhere in a garden in Hertfordshire, roses bloom over the grave of a boy who never learned to speak, but who somehow said everything that needed to be said. Sleep peacefully, surrounded by your own silence, your own mysteries, your own gentle presence in a world that needs more gentleness than it knows how to ask for. Good night, Peter. Good night to all the silent voices, all the patient hearts, all the love that exists without explanation or apology. Good night to the handlers and the held, the caregivers and the cared for, the ones who speak and the ones who listen, and the ones who somehow manage to communicate in languages deeper than words. Good night to the brutal history that shaped us all, and to the gentle love that redeems it. Good night to the questions that don't need answers, and to the answers that don't need questions. Good night.